Are we up? That's good, right? Okay. Actually, that's even a little high for me. Did we do a land acknowledgement this morning?
Yes, I did.
We did? Okay, cool, so I don't have to worry about it.
You betcha.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's good.
I do remember what country I was in.
I know. It feels like Vancouver here, so I'm like, I can't remember. I'm in the U.S. I'm in the U.S. because I was in Vancouver last weekend too. So.
A little bit closer to the mic.
Okay. All right. So I also wanted to acknowledge I was at ConvergeCon last weekend. I know there's a few people here that were in ConvergeCon, right? A few of us, yeah. This crowd has a little different feel. It's interesting, and I'm an anthropologist, so I notice like the cultural feel of things a lot. But I wanted to give an acknowledgement to the people at ConvergeCon last weekend in Vancouver because I really had took a lot of pleasure in thinking with them through the weekend, and the conversations that we had fertilized this talk. So there is a little bit of overlap. And I'm also going to get to make some points that I didn't get to make last week because I was a little too loquacious. So I'll just get started. So the title of this talk, I do have visuals to go with it, but no PowerPoint. So anyway, but I usually just use pictures because it's more interesting to look at. So it's not a problem not to have them. So the title of the talk is Yes, Your Pleasure, Yes, Self-Love, and Don't Forget Settler Sex as a Structure. So there's going to be some theory in here, and I do pay attention to defining words, but I'm somebody who, when I cite philosophers and queer theorists and indigenous theorists, I also cite people in community as my foundational theorists, and I heard the word theory used here on the stage, and we all do theory, meaning we all take analytical frameworks to help us understand the world that we're trying to move through, to deconstruct it in order to think about the kind of world that we actually want to live in. So I think about all of you as theorists too, as I do people in my home tribal community, which I don't know if Lisa, did you say, I'm enrolled Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, but I don't know if we got that part. I'm descended from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma and many other people, as a lot of indigenous people are. So last weekend at ConvergeCon, I was on the closing panel, which was entitled Me Too in the Age of Consent. And I was on that panel with Erin Tillman, who wrote the Consent Guidebook, which has just been published, and I just ordered this for my 15-year-old, so it looks like a great book. And then another sex educator was on that panel with us as well, Genomic Aborn. Both of them are from LA. So there was a final question posed to our panel, and that was, if there was one thing you wanted people to take away from this ConvergeCon weekend about autonomy, agency, power, and creating a culture of consent, what would that be? My response was, remember your structural analysis. Settler sexuality, and I'll explain that in a minute, that gives us this hetero and increasingly homonormative compulsory monogamy society and relationship escalator that is intimately tied up with settler colonial ownership of property and indigenous dispossession is a structure. So I want us to not only think about monogamy and non-monogamy as a choice. So ConvergeCon was refreshing for me with so many people with similar filters about sex talk, meaning let's talk unabashedly about sex, all of it. So they actually had to set up a separate social space this year for between session gabbing because in 2017, there were complaints from normies, that's a new word I learned from Cale Gosen, at the hotel. I know I look like a normie, but I don't think I am. So there were complaints from normies at the hotel about all the sex talk happening in the lobby at the 2017 conference. So sessions at ConvergeCon this year included things like group sex demystified, body positivity, liberation from repressed sexual shame, sex-positive parenting. I loved that one, and I had to call my 15-year-old right away and tell her all about it, and she said, you have the weirdest friends, Mom. So masturbation for healing and creation was another session, how society's representation of beauty impacts sexual self-expression, and how to manage sex and relationships when coping with depression. There were many sessions that teach us as individuals, couples, families, and even communities techniques for liberating ourselves psychologically, emotionally, and even spiritually from sex-negative and shaming thoughts and behaviors. I found fewer sessions that asked us to avert our gazes from our own bodies, individual, family, or community histories, to look hard at the settler state and its structures that not only indoctrinate us with settler ideals, but which have legally and economically enforced certain forms of sex and relationships throughout the existence of these nation states. So my point being, it's necessary to throw off shame, love yourself and your body, rejuvenate and practice self-care, yet an over-focus on even sex-positive bodies and relationships versus an over-focus on sex-negative bodies and relationships is not in and of itself a structural analysis. Focusing on sex and body positivity helps us cultivate the energy to fight systemically. The two are co-constitutive, meaning individual and societal change help produce one another, and I want us to always keep that in mind. The heteropatriarchal state would prefer that we focus our eagle eye on our own shortcomings exclusively, and not its extractive and oppressive structures. So now I'll get to a little bit on the terminology I'm using, settler and settler sexuality. So I have a colleague at Queen's University. He's a queer theorist, Scott Morgenson. He is a settler scholar, that's how he self-identifies. And he's popularized in academic circles, and this bleeds into Indigenous sexual health circles, the term settler sexuality, which he has defined succinctly as the heteropatriarchal and sexual modernity exemplary of white settler civilization. Now, if that's too succinct, he has also explained settler sexuality as a white national heteronormativity, and increasingly also homonormativity, think marriage equality, that regulates Indigenous sexuality and gender by supplanting them with the sexual modernity of settler subjects. So we had different forms of sexualities and relating before the rise of the United States and Canada. So Scott Morgenson's work and the work of other anthropologists and historians of Euro-American settlement, marriage, and monogamy in the US and Canada, and there's some great new books out on histories of marriage in the settler state. This work shows how it was not only Indigenous people that were forced into monogamy and state-sanctioned marriage. Those relationship forms have been intimately tied up with the appropriation of Indigenous collectively held land and its division into individual allotments to be held privately. Men, as heads of household under the Allotment Act, qualified for certain amounts of acreage. They would get more land if they had a wife and children. So women, of course, then were tied to men economically, as they could not originally have access to property ownership without husbands. So compulsory monogamy and marriage have also been forced on other non-monogamous and sometimes non-Christian communities as well. So settler sexuality can be translated more straightforwardly as both heteronormative and homonormative forms of love, sex, and marriage that are always produced along with private property holding in the US and Canada. So therefore, when I use the term settler, I'm not interested in nitpicking who is and is not a settler on an individual level. Now, Americans, I have found, often find the term settler odd. Both Native people and non-Native people have said this to me. They think it sounds too polite. Now, Canadians are a bit more accustomed to the term settler, and they don't find it so polite. But I think Canadians like to think they're more polite than Americans. Well, you know, when I'm on a campus-wide committee at the University of Alberta, being an American, sometimes it takes me 3 weeks to figure out I was being really insulted. I'm like, oh, I was so oblivious they were insulting me because I'm used to an American who would just insult you. I'm not sure which I like better. So some Canadians, though, seem to have the same reaction to the term settler as they do to being called white. They don't really like it. But I also know many academics, both white and visible minorities, that's the term used frequently in Canada for minorities or people of color, and that term can also include recent immigrants. I've heard people in those groups also sometimes identify as settlers, and when they do, it's with explicit recognition that their lives in Canada are actually made possible by settler colonialism. So I work with a lot of South Asian feminist scholars who will call themselves settler scholars as well. But it does tend to get conflated with whiteness kind of a lot. So this is an ongoing conversation. There are vibrant conversations in Canada and in the US, although more so among US academics that are debating the applicability of the term settler and suggest new terms for non-racially privileged, non-Indigenous groups. So for example, African Americans or recent non-white or non-Christian immigrants who are actually entering the US or Canada due to conditions of war and violence, in many cases due to settler state imperialism abroad. So my main point is there are just no untroubled definitions of the category of settler. So instead, I focus on settler colonial state power, including its cultural power, which all of its citizens are capable of shoring up. I see non-Indigenous racially disadvantaged citizens as potentially complicit in settler colonial appropriations of Indigenous resources, and I actually have trouble with that word resources, but that's the best I can do in English. And many of us across racial and religious lines have been made complicit in helping uphold settler forms of sex. Indigenous people do it too. So I just want to give you a quote from Kyle Powys-White. He's a Potawatomi environmental philosopher and activist who teaches at Michigan State. And he has explained very pithily in a recent Yes Magazine article, if you know that, publication, it's online, it's a great magazine. He's explained how the citizenry broadly is involved in ongoing settler colonialism, and so he writes, whether one participates in settler colonialism is not entirely a matter of when or how one's ancestors came to the US. Having settler privilege means that some combination of one's economic security, US citizenship, sense of relationship to the land, mental and physical health, cultural integrity, family values, career aspirations, and spiritual lives are not possible, literally, without the territorial dispossession of Indigenous peoples. So, are non-normative sexualities also settler sexuality? So-called non-normative sexualities and relationship practices such as polyamory, and I would say especially solo polyamory within that, do challenge important settler state cultural restrictions. But they also tend to assume the inevitability of settler colonial cultural norms and governance structures. They do not sufficiently interrogate Indigenous possession for the rise of a private property state. They often simply want to redeem the settler state into a more multicultural and inclusive entity, without asking how even alternative practices of intimate relation uphold settler colonialism. Margot Weiss, an anthropologist who wrote a book, Techniques of Pleasure, that examines kink communities in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, shows how they consume expensive sex toys and play experiences on their way to personal self-actualization. She highlights gender and race dynamics and power relations in kink communities that are sometimes not so different from mainstream settler sexuality. These patterns of individual identity making via capitalist consumption and fairly normative race and gender dynamics rose in concert with settler colonial nation building. She also delves a bit into the interesting history of old guard leather communities in San Francisco that have more oppositional politics historically, but her focus is on newer, more economically privileged kink communities, especially those involving tech sector workers. I don't think we probably have a lot of those people here. Oh, sorry, you're so honest. It's a great book anyway, if it's for people that are interested in kink cultures, it's just a fantastic book. I learned so much because I'm like Miss Vanilla. So,
what's the name of that book?
Techniques of Pleasure. I can't remember, I had it on my slides, but Margot Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, yeah, she's an anthropologist at Wesleyan in, where's that, Connecticut? So Scott Morgenson, who I cited earlier on the settler sex terminology, has done anthropological work in a community of radical fairies, and they're predominantly white back to the land communities. This is in Oregon. So he shows through that work how even queer sex, including non-monogamy and kink, again, are also enacted as forms of settler sexuality sometimes. His work shows how radical fairies in that rural Oregon community remain conditioned by race hierarchy, and their back to the land ideology is of course predicated on Indigenous dispossession historically, and they continue to erase Indigenous presence today. And this is something I think a lot about. In every room I walk into throughout a day, I will hear multiple instances of implicit Indigenous erasure. And I will be calling that out, not to call people out on it, but just for us to see how pervasive it is. You know, pioneer language, discovery language, all of that stuff that gets used a lot in science is actually very much often erasing of Indigenous knowledges and presence. So Morgenson discusses how all queer claims are conditioned by settler colonialism. He pays close attention to Indigenous two-spirit activism and theorizing, and their focus on people or tribal-specific knowledges about sexualities, relations, and relationships. So the term two-spirit, if you don't know the history of that term, gestures toward pre-colonial gender systems not based on European sex-gender binaries that concerned colonizers and which now also concern queer thinkers. If you don't know the history of the term, it's in wide use today, and it actually came into common use in 1990 in Winnipeg at the International Gathering of American Indian and First Nations Gays and Lesbians. That sounds a little dated now, right? So as opposed to coming out, An important aspect of Two-Spirit thought is the idea of coming in to community, to take up special roles designated for gender-diverse individuals within the extended kinship webs of Indigenous communities historically. Or at least that's the ideal. Two-Spirit people have struggled and continue to in Indigenous communities with homophobia produced of colonial violence and indoctrination. So in my Critical Polyamorous blog, I've written about the disproportionate influence that heteronormative couple privilege and associated hierarchies have in polynormative communities. My frustration with that mode of polyamory is explained in my critiques of how it remains, again, a form of settler sexuality. So more rule-bound and couple-centric forms of polyamory privilege, we know this in here, privilege the married, cohabiting, child-sharing couple as primary, with additional relationships being secondary. This replicates key conditions of monogamy that I find politically and ethically very challenging. So in short, it's not only vanilla monogamists who uphold settler colonialism with their intimate practices linked to property, consumption, couple, and marriage privilege. Within open non-monogamy, I'm always pushing for analyses that help us envision ways of relating beyond such normative arrangements and also beyond Western notions of romantic love, conditioned whether we know it or not by capitalism's coercive power. So I don't want Hallmark and Nestle telling me when and how I need to show my love, while also giving those companies my money to evangelize normative relations and unsustainably extract resources. So now let's talk about solo polyamory and being in good relation, and I'll use this phrase a lot, being in good relation. So I'm here with all of you at Solo Polycon because I see more potential in solo polyamory for challenging the assumptions of the settler state. I've considered too the potential for my focus on being in good relation, my Indigenous standpoint, that it might seem to be in conflict with the ethic of autonomy and non-hierarchy that is a mark of solo polyamory. But then I remembered a photo that one of you posted on Facebook during last year's conference, and I had to Skype in because I had strep throat. So that photo was of about a half dozen attendees from this conference hanging out at the beach. And everybody was standing apart. And they seemed to me like stones, like differently colored, differently shaped stones, like very pretty stones just kind of scattered along the beach. And the photo was captioned, "Alone Together." And that image looked so appealing to me. It looked like the kind of community that would understand me and that might be able to be articulated with the idea of being in good relation that is being taken up with renewed commitment by different Indigenous peoples across North America these days. So academics, artists, activists, and Indigenous Twitterati, I've got some recommendations if you want to follow them, are talking a lot about being in good relation. So I can't emphasize enough how much Indigenous thinkers are focusing on what we're calling Indigenous relationality, which is an umbrella term that we're using to help us think beyond race, the nation state, biology, and other settler concepts that have been imposed onto us and all of you. So taking the solo polyamory explanation from our Facebook page, and I'll read it for you. People who practice solo polyamory have lots of kinds of honest, mutually consensual, non-exclusive relationships, from casual and brief to long-lasting and deeply committed. But generally, what makes us solo is the way we value and prioritize our autonomy. We do not have, and many of us don't want or aren't actively seeking, a conventional primary nesting style relationship, sharing of household finances, identifying strongly as a couple, triad, etc. So how do I see that as being articulated with the idea of Indigenous relationality? Autonomy from compulsory monogamy or even the non-monogamous hierarchical couple need not be defined as single because one wants autonomy from that. Solo poly is for me a de-escalation from the couple. For me and others, it is a refusal to get on the escalator, perhaps again. But it can simultaneously also lend itself to living an extended relation and disrupting commonly accepted relationship categories. So many of us in here are working to build networks of made kin as essential support systems and with more fluid boundaries. And many of us do this under settler structural duress. It's just that most solo poly people probably don't name the challenges they face as settler colonialism. So I've written and talked elsewhere about my Dakota ancestors' practices of relating and their sexualities, as we call it today. Before settler-imposed monogamy, marriage helped to forge important Dakota kinship alliances. But divorce for both men and women was possible. Women also owned the household property. They were not tied to men economically in the harsh way of settler marriage. More than two genders were recognized, and there was an element of flexibility in gender identification. People we might call genderqueer today also entered into traditional Dakota marriages with partners who might be what we today consider cisgendered. In a world before settler colonialism, outside the particular biosocial assemblages, and when I use the word biosocial, I'm thinking always about the way our biologies and our social structures make and remake one another. So outside of those biosocial assemblages that now structure settler notions of gender, sex, and sexuality, for my ancestors, persons and the intimacies between them were worked quite differently because all of those categories were different. So when thinking about sex, and I always put quotes around that word, how did my ancestors share touch as a form of care, relating and connection before the imposition of settler structures of sexuality and family? There's much that has been lost due to forced conversions to Christianity and the sexual shaming that comes with that. And so much of settler sexuality has been imposed onto Indigenous peoples in place of our ancestors' practices, both heteronormative and now also queer settler sexuality, our frameworks put onto us. But in a world before settler colonialism and its notions of gender, sex, and sexuality, persons and the intimacies between them were worked quite differently. And yet, despite all of these impositions, we Dakota continue to live in a way that embodies in our 21st century loves long-held kinship structures. Many of us continue to live in extended family where the legally married couple is not central, where children are raised in community, and where households often spill over beyond nuclear family and across generations. Can we not then also imagine sexual intimacies outside of settler structures? I know we already have them, so can we name and measure them without using settler sex and family forms as reference points? So we often consider ourselves as failing at healthy normative relationships, and I want us to stop thinking about ourselves as failing. So it's also important in unsettling settler sex and family to mine historical archives and language archives, so mine our languages, in order to know more about what kinds of relations were possible before settler colonialism, including non-monogamous relationships that were common in Dakota and other Indigenous cultures. So my four-greats-grandfather, who led the 1862 war against German settlers, had 4 wives. They were all sisters. This is common knowledge. You know, we know this. And but it's funny, you know, we take up other decolonization projects, but we just kind of leave that one silent and untouched. And because we've had such extreme sexual shaming and victimization at the hands of missionaries and residential schools and by government agents who wielded a lot of control over the lives of our ancestors, including monitoring who they slept with and how they slept with people. So there are still many of us who have not recovered from the shaming of Christian sexual mores and supposedly secular state institutions that I don't think are so secular, that continue to monitor, measure, and pathologize our bodies and peoples. So with all of that said, though, I am beginning to hear from younger Indigenous people, either via comments on my blog or when I give lectures at universities, who tell me that they want to embrace open and honest non-monogamy. But in addition to a shortage of willing Indigenous partners, and they often do want to partner with Indigenous people, they worry about the judgment of their elders, who are still immersed in values that younger people see as a holdover of the residential schools and of the church. So an Indigenous undergraduate at the University of Alberta recently asked me what my elders think of my non-monogamy, and I remember exactly how I responded. I said to her, I don't know what they think. They don't say anything to me, and I'm pretty open on Facebook and on my Critical Polyamorous blog. But I'm almost 50, and at 55, I get a senior discount on my reservation at all the stores, 10%. So I'm almost an elder myself at home. I also earn my own money, and I'm an academic. So with that comes more freedom than most people have. So I'm not really worried about what people think, but I know you do have to worry. I try to make space for others so someday they will have the choices that I have. Writing and speaking this talk is to make just a little more space. Yet, in our lives as Indigenous peoples, we already unsettle settler relations in very courageous ways. Think about the work that Indigenous people and our allies do to defend the earth in order to have a chance at reconstituting good relations with our other than human relatives. I think of the resistance to resource extraction that particularly Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people have organized through Idle No More and at Standing Rock, sometimes at great personal risk. Those are both movements that link the defense of Indigenous treaty rights to defense of the planet, which is also a way of caring for our human descendants to come. In terms of that idea of being in good relation, I consistently compare environmental, quote-unquote, caretaking to caretaking our human relatives. Accordingly, decolonizing sex is one way of reconstituting good relations with some of our human relatives, and when I use relative there, I mean it broadly, since we're all related. We said that before the geneticists said it. So I'm going to be paying close attention the rest of the weekend at this conference to notice the potential articulations between solo polyamory thought as that's getting worked out here, because this is like the front edge of solo poly theory, right? This conference, and the way that that might articulate with Indigenous thought and practice related to sex and relationships. And it doesn't have to be a complete translation, right? But those points of articulation are good for people as allies. How long have I been talking? Huh?
Perfect amount of time. We got lots of time.
Do we? Because are people getting hungry?
Hungry for more.
Because I'm about to lay down an anthropological story that I hope is not too tedious. That's why I'm playing. This is what I missed at ConvergeCon last week. So this section is called Disaggregating Sex, so taking that object, that idea apart into its constituent pieces, and reaggregating relations. So let's take it apart and let's make it back into relations. And I'm going to give you an example of Moreya Kamem. Excuse me, I have terrible Spanish, so I'm so gringo sounding. So I'm going to use this example of Moreya Kamem to dig a bit deeper into the theory behind being in good relation. And this is an example of non-monogamy, and by settler standards, non-normative sexuality among an Indigenous people in what is today Sonora, Mexico. So there's a type of Indigenous healer there, the Moreya Kamem, who can teach us a lot about being in good relation in ways that refuse settler sexuality. So I have a good friend, David Shorter, who is an Indigenous studies scholar at UCLA. And it's too bad I don't have the pictures because David is super glamorous. Like, he teaches at UCLA and he works with all these psychics and UFO hunters. He looks like it's like a headshot of a movie star. So we don't all get to be that kind of academic. But he wrote an essay entitled simply Sexuality. That essay resulted from the time that Shorter spent with, I'm missing a page here, when he spent time with Moreya Kamem in Sonora. So when he went to study them, he originally set out to understand the spiritual aspects of Moreya Kamem as healers, because he's a religious studies scholar originally. But his analysis came to entangle, quote unquote, spirituality and sexuality. I don't like the term spirituality either, just like I don't like the term sexuality. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A if it doesn't become clear here. So in southern UMA and Sonora, an elder told David Shorter that individuals who engage, when he said, where do I find the Moreya Kamem? The elder said, individuals who engage in non-monogamous and or non-heterosexual relationships are often also Moreya Kamem. In fact, in northern UMA communities in Arizona, Moreya Kamem has come to be conflated with terms such as gay, lesbian, or two-spirit, or other less positive terms. And the healer aspect of the word has been lost for UMA people in the United States, who Shorter describes as having much ethnic overlap with Catholic Mexican American communities. But among southern UMA, Shorter found that he could not understand the powerful spiritual roles and community of Moreya Kamem without also understanding their so-called sexuality. He explains that in many Indigenous contexts, there is an interconnectedness in all aspects of life. Following the connections between sex and spirit among the UMA was akin to following a strand of a spider's web. Shorter sees both sexuality and spirituality, as those acts get worked out, as actually being sets of relations through which power is acquired and exchanged between persons or entities. Didn't somebody bring up the intersections of kink and the sacred here?
Yes.
Yeah. I've learned a lot about power exchange from my kink friends, so I know that this resonates especially for me. So when he writes about Moreya Kamem, he emphasizes their focus on relating and their relational sharing of power with the clients who come to them or with deities or spirits. The Moreya Kamem have reciprocity with and receive power in their encounters with spirits, ancestors, dreams, and animals, and also in the human realm when they use their power to see for and heal other humans who are suffering from love or money problems, addictions, or other afflictions of mind and body that they come seeking treatment for. But even though they do all of this work, the Morea Kamem refuse to accentuate their personal characteristics and capacities. They do not focus on their own so-called sexuality or even on their power to heal. They focus on their work in community. Shorter explains that these healers work tirelessly and selflessly to maintain right relations. And he too refuses to classify Morea Kamem, say, as gay or non-monogamous. Shorter also encourages his readers to de-objectify, I would say decolonize. That is, we should try not to think of sexuality, spirituality, or nature or environment too as things at all. This is difficult, right? In a settler framework, whether in bed or in ceremony, relations become things. They get named or objectified as sex or spirituality. David Shorter asks us to see that what settler culture turns into objects are actually sets of relations in which power and sustenance circulates. The practical outcome of this shift in thinking is that if we resist hardening relations between persons, be they human, non-human, or spirit relations, if we resist hardening those into objects such as sex or spirituality, we might be better attuned to relating justly in practice. We might attend to being in good relation and what that requires, rather than having our relating stifled by less flexible ideas of what's in our nature and the hierarchies that come with that. It is not only for Morea Kamem, but for all of us that sexuality can be understood as a form of reciprocity and power exchange, a way of being that mediates social relations across the family, clan, pueblo, tribe. Thus, we exist not simply in nature, but we exist in relation to one another. With this understanding of sexuality, it begins to look more like a type of power, particularly one capable of healing and transforming. So think of that co-constitution and reconstitution of our sexualities if we are polyamorous. The multiple diverse sets of relations, power exchange, and subjectivities that result from multiple relating. So I'm going to leave you with a powerful quote by David Shorter in this section. He says, sexuality is not like power. Sexuality is a form of power. And of the forms of power, sexuality in particular might prove uniquely efficacious in both individual and collective healing. Further, I will suggest that sexuality's power might be forceful enough to soothe the pains of colonization and the scars of internal colonization. So I've been reading Dominican-American writer Junot Diaz of late, and he has expressed two powerful ideas that have been helpful to me. In his September 2017 interview with Krista Tippett of the On Being podcast, Diaz explained that in this moment of crisis, and always, it is imperative that critical thinkers be misaligned with the emotional baseline of any society. He also explained his notion of radical hope and his trust that, quote, from the bottom will the genius come that makes our ability to live with each other possible. Now, she was asking about the Cheeto era and the election and all that, but he's talking about not necessarily cherry picking that as a unique tragedy in this long history of violence and colonialism. So I see the emotional baseline that he talked about being misaligned from as dreaming of a progressive settler state. I'm writing a lot these days against American and Canadian exceptionalism for that matter. So Tippett asked or recounted to Diaz in that interview his idea that all the fighting in the world will not help us if we do not also have hope, because they were talking about these dire times. And she said, but you've talked about not having blind optimism, but something called radical hope. Can you talk about what that is? And Diaz responded, I do trust in the collective genius of all the people who have survived these wicked systems. I trust in that. And again, I think from the bottom will the genius come that makes our ability to live with each other possible. I believe that with all my heart. So that term radical hope was really nice for me because I have seriously rejected the packaged, commercialized Barack Obama poster of hope that was circulating through those elections, right? I have radical hope that settler relations based on violent hierarchies and concepts of property do not have to be all there is. I know it's basically all we can see right now, but I'm trying to hope that that doesn't have to always be what is in front of us. And that this crisis or transition time in the US and Canada and globally offers an opportunity to cease cultivating a misplaced love for the state that insists on dreams of progress toward a never arriving future of tolerance and good, that paradoxically requires ongoing, genocidal violence, and anti-blackness. The path toward the supposed democratic promised land of settler mythology is in everyday life a nightmare for many at home and around the globe, and we see that across the news today. So if we're going to get rid of that hope and that misplaced love, we require another narrative to guide us, because that love for the settler state has been a guiding narrative. Indigenous people are proposing a relational web framework that's more about the here and the now, and not about when or then. So we have an opportunity, if we choose to see it that way, to be misaligned with the emotional, intellectual, and unethical baseline and narrative of those who hold power. We can have radical hope in a narrative that entails not redeeming the state, but caring for one another as relations. How do we live well here together? The state has and will continue to fail at that and to help us do that. And so I'm going to leave you with a quote from Janet Marie Rogers, who is, I think she's Six Nations, she's Mohawk, and she's a poet and spoken word artist, performance artist, who did a performance at ConvergeCon last weekend. And then I interviewed her for the Media Indigena podcast that I'm a regular on. And this is just such a lovely thing. First, she said, get it right in the bedroom first. I'll read you the quote. She said, I'm coming to the, she has a book called The Red Erotic. It's a lovely book of poetry. And she did publish this in 2010, so she was a bit ahead of the curve. There's a lot of Indigenous erotica coming out after that. But she said in this interview, I'm coming to the realization that the sensitivity, the consideration, the education, the awareness, the awokeness, if you will, within the sex-positive community overflows into that awareness, sensitivity, into how those communities are relating to Indigenous people. Your practice and understanding of your own sexuality overflows into the rest of your life. That's where it begins. If you've got that resolved in the bedroom, all of that empowerment, all of that positivity is going to overflow into other areas of your life. I'm trying to have radical hope that that's true, and I'm going to really try to get it right in the bedroom. So, thank you.
Kim, thank you. It was wonderful. I would love if you deconstructed your discomfort with the term sexuality and some of the other terms that you had said that you were comfortable with.
Well, sexualities, we just did that, right? Like it's turning into an object that, and because I write about the science of race too. I study racial science and genetics. The same thing has happened with sex, right? It's been made into this biological category that gets researched in really hierarchical ways. So our bodies get objectified, and the sexually deviant get objectified like the racially deviant have been objectified. And it's also the state uses that notion to manage us, to measure, poke, and prod us and manage us. And there's, obviously anybody who's read Foucault, there's a history of sexuality that talks a lot about the rise of this category. So spirituality for me it's also solidifying these sets of relations. One of the main troubles I have with it though is I don't think it undoes the damage of the word religion. So you often try, even Native people say this too, well, I'm spiritual, not religious. They're both predicated on a spirit, quote unquote, material divide. And if you look at Indigenous ways of relating, and this is where the circulation of sustenance and power is important. If you have a spirit-material divide like you do in Christianity, for example, if something is sacred, that means something else is profane. We don't have profane things. Just because some land, we might call it sacred in English, if you go back into an Indigenous language, that's a really inept way of talking about it. It's a special place that might have special stories or special deities or an energy or a force or something, but that doesn't mean this place over here is profane or it's just not as important. But there's also the opportunity for new important places to emerge, right? So looking through this Christian lens, this lens of hierarchies of life forms has really perverted, and I don't, that's like we need another word for that, because that's like anti-kink, right? Let me think about it, I'm gonna think about it. It's disrupted Indigenous ways of thinking about the exchange of power and relations, and so I'm writing about this because it's hard to explain. And David and I are working against this notion of spirituality, and Indigenous people don't like that either. So yeah.
I have a question as far as like interracial relationships are involved. Do you feel like it's been a overlapping problem with trying to push settled sexuality on a person of color that they're dating and trying to more establish power over their sexuality and possession over their sexuality? Do you feel like it's more common within interracial relationships?
For people to exercise forms of ownership?
For people who are settled or people who are white or white identified, whatever, to tend to try more to have ownership over the person of color and their sexuality and trying to fit it more into the heteronormative standard?
I don't know, that's actually a really good research question. And I actually have to say, being a Native woman, and I said this last week on the panel, I mean, you know, I grew up in a red-white racial binary world, right? I grew up in a reservation border town in South Dakota. There's not black people, well, there are now, but back in the 70s it was red and white, and we were the despised racial group. So anti-blackness wasn't in your face. I mean, obviously it's always there. I'm telling you this because I say to people, I have non-black privilege, right? You know, I can go certain places leaving the reservation, say I went to Boston, and as soon as I opened my mouth and they realized I wasn't Dominican or Puerto Rican, I got treated basically like a white girl, right? So I don't know, I think it's probably different for different people of color. On the reservation, sure, there's a certain way of getting treated that I would have had to deal with had I stayed, but moving out into these cosmopolitan places where people don't recognize me as an Indigenous person, I do get some privilege out of that where I probably don't get treated like that, but it's a really good question, right? So those settler colonial frameworks, it's not only about the exploitation and appropriation from Indigenous people, and that's the point I was trying to make, right? We all get shaped by that.
Right. We would love to answer all the questions, but we've already gone into lunch break. I know Kim's quite chatty. She probably would be open to some questions. Can I say that for you?
I have a green star.
Yeah, I made the right assumption.
Yeah.
Thank